Good morning.
So we're doing a half-day sitting today. And I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about the Fukanzazengi, which we chanted this morning during service. So I'm going to talk about the first part of it. My intention is to talk about the rest of it in next week's lecture and future lectures. I don't think I can do it in 2 lectures. Okay, so we usually chant Fukanzazengi on Thursday morning. It means, Fukanzazengi means universal promotion of the principles of Zazen. Universal promotion of the principles of Zazen. And it's chanted all over in Soto Zen temples. It's chanted in the monastic setting. The month I spent at Zuyoji, which is a Japanese monastery, Soto Zen monastery in Shikoku, we chanted it every night in Japanese. And we chanted like, Fukanza. I went nuts. It's very hard for me to be patient through that. But of course, I was not patient, but I did it. So anyway, this is a very important text in Soto Zen. And as you know, this was written by Dogen Zenji in the 13th century. And he founded Soto Zen in Japan. The text was written in 1227, and he wrote this. It was like the first thing he wrote when he came back from going to China. And he wrote it because his students wanted to know about how to sit zazen. So this was in response to their questions. And in China, he studied with Ru Jing, who was his transmission teacher, who transmitted Soto Zen to him. And Fukanzazengi is actually a rewrite of an earlier text that was written in the 10th century by a monk named Chung Lu Tzu and on Zazen, and it was called Xiao Chan Yi, which means principles of Zazen. So there are parts of this that are actually verbatim from the earlier text. And Dogen rewrote it because he felt like the earlier text had kind of lost its clarity, and that it was that there were problems, there were fixes that needed to happen. So that's why he rewrote it as Fukanzazengi. So now that the beginning of Fukanzazengi is a series of questions. And, the way we chant it is we just chant, right along, and we don't really stop and put inflections. So I don't know if you all have noticed that the beginning part of it is some questions. And the questions are intended to respond to ideas that probably his students have about the efficacy of why we need to practice Zazen. And so actually a version of this question is supposedly why Dogen went to China, have this question answered, which was kind of a paraphrase of the question is, if all beings are endowed with Dharma nature by birth, why did all Buddhists, some clearly enlightened, find it necessary to seek enlightenment and engage in specific spiritual practice? So if we all have Buddha nature, why are we knocking ourselves out, putting this effort into doing practice, formal practice and informal practice that we do following the teachings? So it was said that these questions could not be answered by his Tendai teachers in Japan. To be honest with you, I find that hard to believe, but that is the question. And he didn't receive satisfactory answers. So that's why he went to China. But when he came back, now he knows the answer to the question for himself, but he's still talking about it. He talks about it in the Genjo Koan, and he talks about this in the Fukanzazengi. I think he talks about it in Benoit, which is the second thing he wrote. Okay, so the text starts out, the way is basically perfect and all pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? The Dharma vehicle is free and untrammeled. What need is there for concentrated effort? So that's the question, right? Why are we doing this? If everything is perfect and all pervading. Okay, so the way here, the word, what he's talking about when he refers to the way, refers to suchness, our reality's perfection, reality just as it is, just bare reality functioning. So it's something else. It's not delusion. It's not realization. It's things just as they are. So that reality in and of itself is perfect, and it's everywhere. It's basically perfect and all pervading. So we can't change it. We don't want to change it, but we couldn't change it if we wanted to change it. Reality is what reality is. But what we do is we change our relationship to it, our understanding of what's happening, about how reality is functioning in our lives. So that's an awful lot about what we're doing in practice, right? Is we're like kind of remodeling for ourselves a way to understand the nature of our experience that will hopefully alleviate suffering, cultivate compassion, wisdom, and skillful means. So then Dogen said, how could it be contingent upon practice realization? So that's that question, you know, how does it, what's its relationship to this practice that we engage in and this thing we call realization or enlightenment? So the way that Dogen's talking about reality's functioning, it's not dependent upon practice realization. We are dependent upon practice realization in order to understand how we embody the way. So knowing that, even knowing that, still our understanding is blocked and often obscured by our attachment to things we want or don't want. This notion of rebecoming, kind of reifying the self, the notions of who we are. So we get attached to these things, to these various agendas that we have. And some of the agendas we know about, and some of the agendas we don't know about that we're engaged in. So part of our practice is kind of waking up to that. So when we enter this way, when we enter, well, we can't enter reality because reality is already us and we are it is functioning, etc. So we can't enter into it. But when we enter into this practice of trying to understand what this is about, we realize that this reality's function is both in here and out there simultaneously. There's this reality, my reality, what we perceive as outside reality, and yet simultaneously there's no difference between the two. So we have particularity, and we have particular perceptual apparatus, and so in some ways we have a unique way of seeing the world. Jocko and I often are like, she'll say, oh, that's orange, and I'm like, that's red. You know, you'd think that we would both see that color as the same. We make that assumption that people can say, okay, everybody agrees that's blue, right? But we don't really know, actually. So we're all like, we have this internal perception of reality, which has to do with our perceptions, our actual eyes, ears, nose, tongue, taste, consciousness. And then there is reality itself functioning, which can be personified. Sometimes in Buddhism it is. It's called like the mind of Vairocana is one way that it's personified. But it's not, I kind of hesitate to say this, I shouldn't have, this wasn't part of my lecture originally. The mind of Vairocana is not like there's some being called Vairocana with a mind that's running the world. That's not what it's about. It's about the idea that the whole world's functioning, the causal conditions all working and functioning together is a kind of mind. Does that make sense? It's a kind of way in which all the causes and conditions functioning actually drive certain, ways of being. Like, for example, the causes and conditions of climate change are functioning in reality and making reality what it is for us. In a way, that's the mind functioning. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so back to my lecture here. So we are trying to enter and transform our relationship to suffering, cultivating gratitude and wisdom and compassion through our understanding of the teachings and the way we observe the nature of our experience. So practice is born with realization, and realization is born with practice. Dogen might say something like, realization studies together with practice, or practice studies together with realization, which means that they are dependent upon each other for their manifestation in any given being time. So this birth, this practice being born with realization and realization being born with practice. So this birth is realizing and practicing the way our reality's compassionate function, this altruistic function. That's what Dogen is calling practice realization, or that's one way to talk about what Dogen calls practice realization. So if you realize, if you understand the meaning of the way as reality's function, then you understand how it works inside and outside as one side, non-dual reality functioning and dual reality functioning simultaneously together. They have to work together. So how do we know this? How do we find out about this? How do we actually engage this practice so that we can become enlightened, awakened to this manifestation? And we do that, one way we do that is through Zazen, this vehicle of Zazen, to wake up. And in order to do that, it requires some concentration and effort. So we talk about Zazen, we say, well, let Zazen do Zazen. So there's one aspect of it. You come to the Zendo, you sit down, and you immediately start thinking about something else. Okay? So in a way, the effort you're making is coming to the Zendo, and that's a good effort to make. And you come to the Zendo, and then you just check out for the 40 minutes or whatever it is. And so in that way, we say it's efficacious because there's something going on under, behind all of that you can't know intellectually. So we say Zazen does Zazen. And yet we still have instructions on how to do Zazen, this concentrated effort, which has to do with continually coming back to the present moment and not getting caught in your thoughts. So those things are also happening in which we're being asked to do this effort, make this effort to keep coming back. That's it. No judgment about it. Just keep coming back. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. So this formal Zazen, because later on in Fukanzazengi, he says, Zazen I speak of is not about sitting or lying down. This formal Zazen that we're doing in the Zendo, sitting Zazen together, this mandala of together sitting Zazen, this is a vehicle for waking up, and it requires effort and concentration. All right, and then Dogen wrote in Fukanzazengi, indeed, the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? The whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? So this whole body is another way to talk about suchness of reality. It's Buddha nature. It's the whole body of everything functioning. And so this can't be tainted by our delusion, right? It's not tainted by our delusion. Our perception of it may be tainted by our delusion. Our ability to manifest compassion may be tainted by our delusion. But reality itself is doing its own thing that is not obstructed by our delusion, nor is it obstructed by our enlightenment. It is just reality itself doing what it does. So we can find ourselves unable to connect with Buddha nature. We can find ourselves unable to connect with this mind of Vairocana. We can find ourselves unable to engage and manifest our true nature. But it's always with us, it's always presencing, it's always functioning, and it's not going anywhere, because it is us and we are it. And so this is our essential being, is Buddha nature, reality itself, things just as they are. So how can what is already clean, Dogen asks, indeed, the whole body's far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? So how can something that's already clean or pure be brushed clean? And purity, by the way, doesn't mean some kind of, doesn't have Christian connotations. It just means that it's untainted. That's all, by delusion. So purity, from that perspective, includes delusion and realization, and is something beyond delusion and realization. Again, it is just what it is, what's functioning, reality itself. So we don't have to fix it, right? Therefore, we don't have to find a means to brush it clean. So again, goes back to this essential question about making effort and practice, and it comes up over and over and over again in Soto Zen. Now, this idea of brushing it clean and not needing to brush it clean comes from two verses that are found in the Platform Sutra of the sixth ancestor. So in this, I won't go into the story of how these verses came about, but in the Platform Sutra, one of the monks, Shinshu, wrote, "The body is a Bodhi tree, the mind is like a bright mirror stand. At all times, we must strive to polish it and must not let dust collect." Okay, so this polishing and not letting dust collect is what Dogen is saying, you're referring to. So the admonition that Shinshu is saying is, he's saying, you have to work at this. You have to practice, because your delusion gets in the way of this bright mirror. And so you have to polish the mirror. You have to keep the dust off the mirror. So I think, Shinshu is addressing the relative question of practice. He's saying, you have to practice. You have to make effort here. Now, Shinshu's observation is not necessarily wrong. And if you know the story of the sixth ancestor comes along and he has somebody, he's supposed to be illiterate. He has somebody write another verse on the wall, and this verse is supposed to be better. But I would suggest to you it's not necessarily better. It's just a different view. Shinshu's view is a relative view. Wei Ning's view is the view of non-duality. And this is what Wei Ning says. He says, Bodhi originally has no tree, the mirror no stand. Buddha nature is always clear and pure. Where is there room for dust? So this is this response of non-duality, the response of things just as they are, perfect just as they are. And the other, Shinshu is saying, no, you have to practice. They are not contradicting each other, right? They're just different. Okay, so we can't miss Shinshu's verse just because he's addressing the relative. Both of these things are functioning simultaneously. So then Dogen wrote, it is never apart from one right where one is. What is the use of going off here and there to practice? So this makes sense, since the way is the reality itself, it's the whole body. it's suchness, it's things as they are, this total functioning of the world's process. And that's what we're trying to bring forward, right? To inform the nature of our experience. So technically wisdom means lacking inherent existence. So that means that we're actually all connected, because if we lack inherent existence, it means that everything is co-functioning together. This co-functioning manifests as compassion, right? Does that make sense? Co-functioning and emptiness and compassion are exactly the same thing. They're just two sides of one coin. And then when you spend that coin, that's called skillful means. You spend the coin, you do something that's helpful, that's efficacious, that's the right thing for the moment. That's skillful means. Okay, so all of that is accessible to us all the time. It is the air we breathe. It is the land we walk. It is everything. It is reality. So Dogen's saying, well, if it's not apart from one, right where one is, what's the use of going off here and there to practice? What's the use of going somewhere else? Well, I would say there is some value to that, which is it might be that you need to find a teacher. So you might need to go somewhere else other than your living room in order to be able to practice. You might need to actually go and seek out a teacher. So in that way, we do need to go somewhere else. But on another level, we don't have to be a different person. We don't have to have a different lifetime. We don't have to, it is already our essential nature. We lack inherent existence, therefore we have the capacity for compassion and empathy. Therefore, we can engage in skillful means. So the next line is, and yet if there is the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. So if our understanding of this is just off by a bit, it's like the distance from heaven from earth. If you misunderstand the doctrine of emptiness and you think that it's nihilistic, you think it means that everything is empty, like there is no thing, but you don't know the part about what it's empty of is inherent existence. And so you say to yourself, well, if everything's empty, then why bother practicing? It doesn't mean anything. I'm just going to die. There's no there there. If that's what you think emptiness is, then that's a problem. And that's a misunderstanding that's going to create really big problems for you. So that's why it said the doctrine of emptiness is a very dangerous teaching, because if you don't understand that it actually means compassion, connection, and you just think it means separation, which it doesn't at all, that's a problem. And then you have this distance as far as heaven from earth. And so that's a kind of, I don't know, maybe I should say extreme example, but there are other ways in which we just get confused. People come and talk to me about practice, and it's just a turn. It's just a turn of the mind to realize that there is something that you're just misunderstanding a little bit. That's why it's really good to come and talk to your teacher about your practice, because it might be that you're just kind of like missing something. You got it skewed a little bit. And then, supposedly Ajahn Chah said, well, the teacher's job is to sit leaning against a tree on the side of the path. And as the students go by, the teacher says, a little to the right, a little to the left, right? Just a little this way, a little that way. So, and of course, that's true for us as well as teachers, as we, can get off, just a little off. And then there's a problem, a big problem. So what's the use of going off here and there to practice when it's all right here? And the other side of this is that often we think that wherever we are is not enough. Like, I need to go to the monastery. I need to go to some big temple somewhere. I need to do this. I need to do that. If only I could do this. If only I could do that. So we put off practice. We don't practice because we're always saying to ourselves, well, this isn't the right circumstance. This isn't the right day. I don't feel like it. I don't feel like and specifically getting up or going to the Zendo. I don't feel like it. I don't this, I don't that. So that's this way in which, he's saying, well, you don't have to go anywhere else. Just really ground yourself in your life and what's right in front of you. Then he says, and yet, if there is the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. So I talked about that. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost as confusion. So again, I think I talked about that. So we, these likes and dislikes that we have really do push us around. Sometimes we have likes and dislikes that are about trauma. Okay, this is different. I'm talking about likes and dislikes that are like, I don't like peas. I'm talking about likes and dislikes that seem very big to us, but they're really not about trauma. They're about, I just don't feel like doing this today. It's like if you push yourself past that place, that's a good thing. Sometimes when we're traumatized and we push ourselves past the place, that's not a good thing. All it does is reactivate the trauma. So we're not talking about doing that. But we're talking about formal practice requires us to put ourselves in a chute, right? Lou Richmond used to say it's like one of those, do you remember those little things, those woven things you put your finger in? And the more you push, you can't get pulled, you can't get your fingers out. Well, he said it's kind of like that, it's you're voluntarily putting your fingers in there. So I don't know if that's a good analogy, but are going into a chute. You're saying, okay, I'm going to go to the Zendo. I'm going to do formal practice for 2 hours or an hour and a half or whatever it is. And I'm going to do my best to make my best effort to do this practice, the whole part of it that I can. And resistances are going to come up. You're going to say, I don't like peas. I don't want to stand in Shashu now. I don't want to do this, that, or the other thing. Am I worshiping a statue? I don't want to worship a statue, Then you go to your teacher, say, am I worshiping a statue? And she or he says, well, no, actually, you're not. They say you're not worshiping a statue. So then you can get that out there and clarify it. Okay, so this is this thing about you get lost in confusion if we get caught up in likes and dislikes. All right, so I think that because of our little break here, I'm just going to stop on this part and pick up afterwards because I think I've been talking for a while. Okay, I've changed my mind. I'm going to do the next section here. Okay, so suppose one gains pride of understanding and inflates one's own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things, attaining the way and clarifying the mind. Raising an aspiration to escalate the very sky, one is making the initial partial excursions about the frontiers, but is still somewhat deficient in the vital way of total emancipation. Okay, so he's basically saying here, a little bit of knowledge can be a very dangerous thing. So you gain some amount of understanding, and through that understanding, you gain pride about that, and you inflate your own enlightenment. I have to tell you that this is not something I usually see with Americans. It is something I saw at Tassajara with some of the folks who were really good at going into these kind of jhana trance states when they were sitting zazen. So that was something that people would think, well, I go into these kind of states of samadhi when I'm sitting zazen. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether I'm nice to other people. It doesn't matter whether I cultivate the bodhisattva path. What's most important is that I am one damn good sitter. And actually, they're not one damn good sitter. They might be a damn good sitter in another tradition, but in Soto Zen, that's not what we're doing. We're not going into some kind of samadhi state when we're sitting zazen. Not that kind of samadhi state where you actually lose contact with the reality that you're sitting in, with reality functioning in that moment in the room, what's going on. So he says, this glimpse here, the glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things and attaining the way and clarifying the mind, raising an aspiration to escalate the very sky. So I would say that what he's talking about here is when we have this visceral experience of non-duality, or let's say samadhi. So samadhi, having these experiences in and of themselves, is probably helpful, right? Encourages your practice. So that's not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that kind of experience. But what is a problem is if you start chasing after it. What is a problem is you have an experience like that. A, you think it's enlightenment. And B, you start running after these special experiences. So that's a problem. I think that's what Dogen's saying here. He says, you know, suppose one gains pride of understanding and inflates one's own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things. So that's where I think glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things. That's where I think he's talking about this kind of experience of non-duality that we can get caught in. And so we don't want to chase after that. That's why teachers, you know, people come in and you read this, teachers, somebody will say, well, I went in and I talked to my teacher and I told him I had this amazing samadhi experience. And the teacher says, well, that's nice, dear, essentially. And it is nice. And now what are you going to do? Like, what are you going to do when you go to the grocery store? What are you going to do when you go home to your partner and you have a fight? What are you going to do? That's where is the samadhi then, right? So that's where we're doing the bodhisattva path here. And that bodhisattva path, as we say, is to save all beings. Beings are numberless. And in the morning we say, I vow to benefit them. So you can have all the samadhi experiences you want to, but if it doesn't result in benefiting and helping, creating a kind of sane, intelligent compassion that's efficacious, then you're not doing the bodhisattva practice. You may be doing another practice, but you're not doing bodhisattva practice. So I think that's what he's saying here is this. He's saying this glimpse of non-duality should not be mistaken for realization. All right, so I'm going to stop now. That's part one, to be continued.